The content of this episode is for entertainment purposes only. Historical events discussed are based on documented records and scholarly research. This episode contains discussions of gendered violence, property exploitation, and systematic persecution. The Velvet Guillotine does not endorse any political, religious, or ideological interpretation of the events portrayed. The criticism offered here is directed at the documented conduct of specific historical actors and the institutional structures of a particular era, not at any faith, religious community, or the belief of that community's adherents. This episode is told in remembrance of the people, overwhelmingly women, who were accused, tortured, and killed in the European witch trials. Listener discretion is advised. The main episode this week gave you the witch trials as an event, Würzburg and then Bamberg 80 miles east, the machinery, the chronicle, the names, the purpose-built prison, and the men who ran it. The thing is, it actually happened. The postscript is going to do something much, much colder, and I'm going to do it on purpose. I'm going to take the theology, the devil, the pact, the Sabbath, the whole supernatural apparatus that the participants believed they were operating inside of, and I'm going to set it to one side. And then I'm going to look at what is left when you do that. And then I'm going to look at the data. Across the witch trial era in Europe, roughly 1450 to 1750, with the worst of it concentrated in the late 16th and early 17th centuries, somewhere between 40 and 60,000 people were executed for witchcraft. More than 1,000 were tried. The geographic weight fell on German territories, Switzerland, Scotland, and France, with significant secondary outbreaks in Scandinavia and the American colonies. Shout out to Salem. This is a great deal of data. And data examined without the theological framework that the participants were standing inside of, it turns out to be remarkably talkative. Who was accused? What did they have in common? What did the accuser stand to gain? What were the structural conditions that made an accusation more or less likely? I want you to ask those questions. Treat the witch trial accusations as a social phenomenon rather than a theological one. And when you do that, the pattern that comes up out of those numbers is not random at all. It is not the irrational explosion of superstitious violence that the popular story likes to tell you and want you to believe. It is specific, it is legible, and it has a shape. And the shape tells you exactly what the witch trials were actually doing in the communities that ran them. Welcome to the Velvet Guillotine. I am April Rain, so let's look at that data. The single most cited statistic about witch trial victims is the gender breakdown. Roughly 75 to 80% of those executed for witchcraft across all of Europe were women. That number is actually well established and not seriously disputed. The explanations offered for it, though, vary a great deal. And the one offered most often is, in my mind, the one that explains it the least. The common explanation kind of runs like this. The theology of witchcraft, codified in the Milesis Maleficarum, and texts just like it, identified women as more susceptible to the devil, more carnal, more easily deceived, more inclined to revenge through supernatural means. The executions simply reflected that theology. Women were targeted because women had been theologically designated as the witches. And that is true, as a description of what the persecutors believed anyway. It is entirely insufficient as an account of why the targeting actually happened in the first place, because it only asks a question that nobody needed to ask, and it dodges the one that really matters. The theology of female susceptibility was not new. The Milesis was published in 1486, and the doctrine that it codified was older even than that. But the great surge in executions did not come in 1486. It actually came in a much narrower window, about a century and a half later, in the late 16th and early 17th centuries. If the theology were the cause, then the bodies would track that theology, right? Guess what? They don't. Something else was setting the pace instead. Something that took a long-standing prejudice and in a very specific window made it suddenly, lethally actionable. The sociological research on who was accused, including the works of historians like Christina Larner, Marianne Hester, and Ann Barstow, well, it points to something more structural and more damning. Because the women most frequently accused were not simply women. They were specific kinds of women. Older women, widowed women, women without a male protector, and women who had broken a gender norm in some legible way. And I want you to hold on to this one, ladies and gentlemen. Women who held property in ways that made them economically significant and socially conspicuous. And that reframes the entire statistic. The accusation of witchcraft was not only an expression of theological misogyny, it was, in a great many documented cases, a tool, a procedure for managing women who had, in some specific sense, gotten outside the boundaries of what a woman was permitted to be and to own. The theology actually supplied the language, but it didn't supply the motive. For the motive, as ever on this show, you need to follow the property. So let's follow it. Because when you lay the economic data alongside the accusations, what you come up with is not noise. The historian Silvia Federici, in Caliban and the Witch, argues for a direct link between the enclosure of common lands in early modern Europe, that's the privatization of land that had been held in common, and the surge in witch persecutions. Her case is contested among many historians, though, and it's probably overstated in its specifics. That is something that I want to flag honestly rather than just launder a dispute claim past you. Okay? But it points at something very real. The economic upheavals of the early modern period landed with particular and severe force on women. And that force intersected with the trials in a way that is not a coincidence. Let me put it more plainly for you, because the records already do a marvelous job. In a substantial number of documented cases, the execution of the accused was followed with tidiness that ought to embarrass the theology by the transfer of property. A widow controlling land that a neighbor wanted, a healer running an independent practice that competed with someone established, a woman who had inherited an estate that would revert to male relatives the moment that she was convicted. And the confiscation was not a corruption of this process. It was the process. In most jurisdictions, the seizure of a convicted witch's property was standard legal procedure. The cost of the persecution was billed to the estate. We already covered that in the main episode. The family receiving the body and the invoice in the same delivery. Can you believe that? They billed these people? Anyway, what was left after that bill was the land, the livestock, and the household goods. Those all went to heirs, to creditors, to the state, to the church, and that largely depended on where you were standing when you were burned. Now, I'm going to tell you that every accusation was not a property grab. The motives were as mixed as motives ever are. There were private grudges, there was genuine terror, and then there was the self-feeding engine of forced naming. But property was, in case after documented case, a factor. A property factor follows a precise grain. It attaches to women who had property, which in early modern Europe meant women who were, in some way, standing outside the normal structures of male control. The widow, the unmarried woman with means, the midwife who had built an independent living. These are the women who show up disproportionately in the early stages of the trials. And these are the women whose deaths had specific, calculable, bankable consequences for specific other people. And the theology asked who had made a pact with the devil, but the ledger asked who had something worth taking. You read enough cases, and you start to notice that those two questions producing sometimes the same names. One of the most contested debates in witch trial historiography is whether the trial specifically targeted healers, midwives, cunning women, wise women, as a way of clearing out competition for the emerging male medical profession. The strong version of that argument is associated most closely with Barbara Einrich's and Deidre English's 1973 pamphlet Witches, Midwives, and Nurses, which framed the trials as in part a campaign by male practitioners to eliminate the female healers who had traditionally met most communities' medical needs. Healers who represented both economic competition and a challenge to the new authority of formally trained medicine. And I have to be straight with you, because intellectual honesty cuts in both directions. Subsequent scholarship has significantly challenged that version very strongly. Statistically, midwives and healers were not disproportionately represented among witch trial victims relative to other women. The claim that the trials were primarily or specifically anti-healer is more than that data will actually bear. Now, there is a little kernel of truth inside of all of this that does survive that methodological filleting, and it's worth holding it up to the light. The category of cunning folk included healers, herbalists, diviners, and the people who worked somewhere between folk medicine and folk magic. Well, they were specifically vulnerable in particular places and periods, and for reasons written into the theology itself. Because the malice and texts like it made a very deliberate argument against beneficial magic. The healing, protective charms, the finding of lost things, benevolent practices were no less diabolical than malevolent practices, because it drew on the same satanic power. So I want you to sit with the cold logic of that for just a second, because it is one of the most quietly vicious moves in this whole framework. If you were a healer whose practices looked like magic, the theology refused to distinguish between you and someone supposedly causing harm. You were both in a pact with the devil. The good you did was not a defense. It was only further evidence. And the intention did not matter. And a framework in which intention does not matter is not a framework for finding the guilty. It's a framework for convicting the chosen. The effect, flattening the line between harmful and beneficial folk magic, left the entire traditional healer community exposed in a way that it had not before. Whether that was a deliberate strategy or structural side effect is a question historians genuinely debate to this day. The vulnerability it produced was real either way, though, and it fell predictably on women who had built something of their very own. If the witch trials were simply a spontaneous eruption of irrational violence, then you would expect them more or less evenly spread across Europe, right? Guess what? They were not. The geographic concentration in the German territories, Switzerland, Scotland, and Lorraine is one of the most important features of the whole era. And it is also one of the least discussed in the whole popular telling. Because randomness has no map. And this had a map. The worst affected regions shared a specific set of structural features. And I want to name them, because they're actually the same four that this show keeps arriving at no matter which atrocity I put up on this table. The first is fragmented political authority. The German territories especially were packed with a patchwork of hundreds of separate jurisdictions. You had principalities, you had areas run by bishops, you had free cities, and each one of those with its own courts and its own local authorities, which meant the oversight that might have curbed the worst of the prosecutions, some type of intervention of a higher power imposing procedural standards, well, that was largely absent. Each little jurisdiction ran on its own trials with almost nothing checking it. Concentrated authority and no external break. We've been there before. We were actually there last week. And that brings me to the second, which is active religious competition. The regions hit hardest were those where Protestantism and Catholicism were most fiercely contesting the same ground. Now, this was not a Catholic phenomenon or a Protestant one, because both sides actually ran witch trials, and they both did so enthusiastically. But the intensity of the competition raised the stakes of demonstrating doctrinal purity and a purified community. And that fed straight into the logic of persecution. Because nothing proves that you're godly like burning the godless next door, right? And that's going to bring me to the third thing, which is economic and social stress. The correlation between crop failure, economic collapse, epidemic disease, and a subsequent spike in the prosecutions has been documented across region after region. The communities under severe stress showed elevated prosecution rates in the years that followed that. The mechanism is not mysterious. A community desperate for an explanation of its suffering found the witch trial framework sitting right there, ready to supply one, and complete with a culprit that you could already arrest. Which brings me, lastly, to weak protections for the accused. Regions with more developed legal safeguards, they had actual representation, stricter evidentiary standards, and they relied less on torture. Those regions showed remarkably lower prosecution and conviction rates. The legal framework was never neutral. It shaped the outcomes in entirely predictable directions. Remove the brakes, and the machine ran. But if you leave the brakes on, it always stalls. So the geography is really not random. It follows the grooves of structural vulnerability: political, religious, economic, and legal. And that, I think, is the quietly hopeful part buried in all of this grim episode. Because if the violence followed structure rather than human nature, then it is not inevitable. Different conditions produce different outcomes. In some places, the brakes held. The horror was not written into us. It was written into specific institutional arrangements, into the arrangements that could have been built differently. And in some places, they were. So now I want to talk about the accusers. Because the popular image of the hysterical neighbor or the superstitious peasant or the vindictive personal enemy, none of those are exactly wrong, but they are pretty badly incomplete. Accusations came from everywhere. Personal enemies who saw a chance to point the legal system at somebody that they disliked. Business rivals. Neighbors locked in a long property dispute. People who sincerely believed in witchcraft and sincerely believed the accused had harmed them. People under their own torture. People who were naming whoever surfaced in a broken mind to make that particular pain stop. The full ordinary range of human motive, and it was handed a very lethal instrument. And then there is the source that gets the least amount of attention. And I think that it is the most important of this whole episode, actually. Those are the people who were themselves afraid. Because in a community that is actively running witch trials, a specific and terrible pressure builds. Failing to accuse could itself start to look suspicious. And being close to someone who had been accused could make you vulnerable. And so participating, visibly, actively, helpfully, became a form of insurance. Every accusation that you made was a demonstration of your distance from the accused, of your orthodoxy, and of your safe membership in the community of the not yet burned. You did not point at your neighbor only because you hated her. Sometimes you pointed because the alternative was to be pointed at yourself. That mechanism, the pressure that turns frightened bystanders into active participants as a matter of self-preservation, is one of the most important structural features of the entire phenomenon. and it is the one that ties the witch trial most directly to other systems of persecution. It is also instantly recognizable. It shows up in 20th century political machines built on wholly different ideologies and identical social mechanisms. The denunciation as a survival strategy. The participation as proof of loyalty. It's the same move in a different costume. So the accuser was not always the beneficiary. Sometimes they profited, sometimes they were genuinely terrified, and sometimes they were buying their own safety with somebody else's life. The motives were as varied as motives in any other mass human behavior. What did not vary, what was the constant underneath all of this, was the institutional framework that made an accusation actionable, that converted private grievance, private fear, and private opportunism into legal process with a body at the end of it. The institution did not manufacture the motives. People supply those for free in every single century. What the institution did supply was the mechanism that turned them into executions. And that is the thing worth indicting. Not human beings are frightened, greedy, and vindictive. We already knew that. But what it indicted was that a system stood ready to convert those ordinary failings into fire. Okay, so let me pull back and state very plainly the case that I have been building this whole time, because the data has actually earned a verdict from me. Strip away the supernatural frame and look at the witch trials as a social phenomenon. Who was accused, where, under what conditions, by whom, and to whose benefit. And what you're looking at is not irrational violence. It's a mechanism, a predictable, learnable, structurally reproducible mechanism for managing certain kinds of social tension. You see the targeting of women who stepped outside the permitted role, who held property of their own, who ran an economic life outside of male institutional control, who lived without a man to stand between them and an accusation. And you see legal procedure used to accomplish what would otherwise have required naked violence. The transfer of property, the removal of inconvenient people, the reassertion of social order that economic change had disrupted. The burning did the work of the robbery and then turned around and called it justice. And in the end, you see the self-expanding engine of force name turning in on itself and the very community that built it. Climbing the social ladder once the marginal were executed, consuming counselors and canons and the family of the men running the trials, exactly as it did in Würzburg and Bamberg. And you see in the geography and the timing, the four structural conditions that decide whether the mechanism ever switches on. The fragmented authority, the competitive religious fervor, the economic stress, and the weak protection for the accused. Every one of these features is recognizable. Every one of them appears outside of the witch trials, and they appear in context with no witches in them at all. And every one of them also has a contemporary analog, because we see them all the time. We see them in the systems of political persecution. We see them in institutional processes for crushing internal dissent. And we see them in the specific legal and social machinery by which some communities are made far more vulnerable to accusation and persecution than others. The witch trial is not a medieval apparition. It is a template, and history returns to it whenever those four conditions line up. Identifying the template, stripping off the theological costume and seeing the mechanism underneath is the most useful thing that we can do with this type of history, because that template is still in service today. It has changed its vocabulary and it has updated its paperwork, but that mechanism is exactly the same. Now, I want to leave you with one woman. She has no name in the record, and she appears in a trial document from a small German village in the early 17th century. She is identified only by her relationship to a man who had recently died, his widow, and by the property that she now controlled, which was substantial for that community. A neighbor accused her. The neighbor's specific grievance is not written down. She was tried. She confessed under torture. And she named accomplices. And the list of names that she gave included women the neighbor had been in disputes with, and the women who owned the land adjacent to her own. She was executed. Her property was confiscated, and the costs of her trial were billed to her estate. And that neighbor's land disputes, well, they subsequently resolved in the neighbor's favor. There are two sets of records about this woman. The theological record describes what happened to her soul: the pact, the sin, the judgment, the cleansing of the community. The other record, which is the property record, it describes what happened to her land: the seizure, the transfer, the new owner, and the settled dispute. And only one of those records is telling the truth about why she died, and it's not the one that mentions the devil. This has been The Velvet Guillotine, and I'm April Rain. Lindell Roper's Witch Craze and Brian Levick's The Witch Hunt in Early Modern Europe are the essential starting points for the scholarship. For the gendered dimension specifically, Marianne Hester's Lewd Women and Wicked Witches is rigorous and important. And for the structural argument linking the trials to a broader pattern of social control, Sylvia Federici's Caliban and the Witch is worth engaging, even where its specific claims are contested. The argument is still reaching for something far larger than any single disputed point. Stay dark.